would someone volunteer to read that? Read any.
The worst form of inequality is to try to make unequal things equal, by Aristotle.
Thank you. I'm not going to go into detail about this quotation, but I'd like you guys to keep it in the back of your mind throughout the speech, because it's very important. We begin in the State University of New York in Albany, home to many successful Division I athletic programs, specifically the wrestling team. This team, in an 18-year period, has only had one losing season. One. In 18 years, they had 5 Olympic wrestlers. In 1995, they were removed from the NCAA Division I program due to something called gender equity. Gender equity is a term used by collegiate coaches describing the quota they have to meet for all men's and women's sports. So, for example, for every $1 you spend on one male, you have to spend $1 on one female. So what if you have 2 males? That $1 now turns into 50 cents. That's how it works. So if this all kind of just came into fruition, it should kind of, in theory, work its way through the whole collegiate system. So why should it be an issue, right? Well, the issue is one not so simple to solve and answer, and that is the PATT Make Equal Opportunity in Education Act, better known as Title IX. Title IX is not really all that of a bad thing. As a matter of fact, I support most of Title IX, about 80%. But that 20%, that small percentage, is something that really bugs me as a college athlete, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So allow me to address what Title IX really is before we get into the persuasion. Title IX was enacted in 72 as part of the Civil Rights Act of 64. The quotation actually goes like this: "No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from, participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance." Now, nowhere in Title IX does it actually directly inhibit the participation in men's sports, but after 30 years, since this has been enacted, almost 40 now, there has been some controversy. And the main question is, if Title IX in no way dictates the cutting of men's sports, why then are dozens of sports each year cut from NCAA Division I schools? The question is actually very simple, and most of you might know it by now. In fact, I call it the elephant in the room, so let's address it. Men's football. Yeah, men's football. Division I sports are run much like a business. Any good businessman would ask you, why keep non-revenue sports? Sports like I'm in, track and field. To be perfectly honest, track and field does not make any profit at the end of the season. But football does. Football can actually work on its own budget and still come out with profit, and that still leaves room for a number of scholarships. Now, between 1994 and 1996, the teams, the NCAA schools, in those 2 years that refused to cut football funding chose to cut other men's sports, which is why this has become controversial, because Title IX doesn't actually say any of this, but schools opt to do this easier alternative. So in 94 to 96, these schools eliminated 16 swimming programs, 31 golf programs, 22 tennis programs, 24 wrestling programs, here's the kicker, 60 track programs. 60. That's 153 total teams in 2 years. Over thousands of individual opportunities were just wiped away. And there are plenty of great athletes that missed their chance just because they couldn't receive funding from a school because of that small little clause in Title IX. Middle Tennessee State wrestling coach Brian Nepper says it best: "A law intended to be one not to discriminate based on sex is actually allowing it. You can cut men's sports and basically discriminate against them in order to make it equal. That is not true equality." An example of this quotation stems from California State University, Bakersfield. In attempts to achieve quota for the proportionality rule, they cut men's sports, which has now become pretty obvious that that's what most schools are going to do. They actually overlooked a very important fact, though. Of the 64% of that female-populated school, over 15% of that school, of the women in that school, were actually over the age of 30. And it's likely that those people over the age of 30 will not participate in Division I athletics, which kind of skews this data a little bit. Which begs the question, how willing are these female athletes to participate at the Division I level? How many females are actually going into college with the mindset that they want to be an athlete? And when Title IX was first enacted, it made leaps and bounds for women. It offered not only athletic aid, but financial aid that was unmatched at that time in the 70s. And as far as today, it still works, and it's still a great thing, which is why I support the majority of Title IX. But that was in 1970. Decades later, growth in women's sports has almost stopped in comparison to men's. This means that Title IX is actually doing more bad for men's sports than good for women's sports. And so it's quite easy for me to say with confidence that Title IX, that particular clause, is pretty outdated. And since this is the case, it must be rewritten to better accommodate aspiring athletes for both genders equally. Now, Congress has a lot on its plate, so I wouldn't expect them to go through Title IX every day. They just got finished with healthcare, which is pretty hard in itself. But things change over time, much like healthcare. And so Title IX can change also. And me, a simple freshman in college, has even come up with some very easy first steps in the long run to better the whole equality part of Title IX. And the first is there to address that there is an issue. And I've already done that with college football. Yes, that is the biggest issue as far as Title IX and the equality rule, because the average major Division I school, excluding RMU because it's not major, the average major Division I school will have around 300 varsity athletes. And of those 300 varsity athletes, 100 of them will be male football players, which leaves 50 other male athletes to be dispersed around the rest of the population, because the 100 has to be matched for female athletes, and then that last 100 out of the 300 needs to be cut in half for males and females. Now, the main issue, of course, is that football is kind of overrunning our funding. But there's also room to compromise for a solution, which is my biggest point. Now, there is no football equivalent for females, but there has to be some other way without creating these extreme numbers for female athletes and for funding. There has to be that solution that can better proportionalize men and female sports, because, quite frankly, football is in a league of its own. So, that being said, Title IX does present itself with somewhat of a paradox. Yes, it does offer tremendous aid and equality for women, and yes, it does this at the expense of men's financial aid. I alone cannot solve it, and none of us alone can solve it. I only hope that one day everyone is happy with their financial aid. But ask yourselves this question: is it fair to tip the scales in the opposite direction? In the 70s, when women were at the bottom and men were at the top in college, they tipped the scales, and when it hit even, it kept going. So, look back to this quotation. The worst form of inequality is to try to make unequal things equal. And it's pretty safe to establish that men's sports, because of college football, will never be equal to women's sports. And so, is overcompensation really a good thing? Are we really going to continue to fight this forever, never-ending paradox? Ask yourselves, and pray for a better world in collegiate athletics.